we're discussing Bernie Sanders, let's go to an interesting issue that's come up. And I like this story because this story is finally um, members of the Democratic Party declaring themselves or discerning difference between the candidates. And of course, you know the difference between Sanders and Biden. But if the public itself is looking at this situation, they may not necessarily know all of the key differences. Biden calls himself the most progressive. Now, him using the term progressive to describe himself in and of himself tears all notion of what the word means. But this, to some degree, gives Sanders an in. Now, the contestants who are running in the race, the 20 people who are in the Democratic Party's race, I think it's like 22, but there's going to be up to this point 17 that's been declared on the debate stage as we know it. But there will likely be more. They've issued a policy of not attacking one another, meaning to have this to be a substantive race. Now, I would make the case that you can't necessarily buy this if you're one Mr. Bernie Sanders, because ultimately you know that they want to attack you without having their fingerprints on the attack. Kind of like the way that they were attacking Trump, trying to use the Ukrainian government to do so, where they can kind of take their hands off of it, all the while having a DNC operative. Yes, I've added that story in. That was a story I did yesterday at the store. It's mind-blowing. But you get my point. If you're Sanders, you shouldn't believe this. But on the overt level, you've decided not to attack one another. Now, there are political reasons that you've decided not to do this. This is not just because you want to be kumbaya. Any attack that's used between you will most likely also possibly be used by Trump depending on the attack, especially if you're going negative. The attack that Sanders, how can you be a socialist? You made $1 million after you wrote a book. The Republican Party appropriated that attack immediately after that was issued against Sanders. They were going to do that for anything, regardless of who exceeds the primaries. So it makes a certain degree of sense to say, let's not overly hit one another. Now, if you think back to the election between Hillary Clinton and Obama, you may ask yourself, why were they able to be smash mouth, but this election not so much? If you remember, there was somewhat of an interregnum. The Republican Party had their own primary that was taking place. The Democratic Party was also having a primary. I mean, both were having their primaries around the same time. There wasn't a successor per se. Bush was finishing its second and last term. It was up for grabs. They could be a bit more smash mouth. In this case, they know Donald Trump is going to use any and everything against them. And they have made this kind of allegiance to take down Trump. So that's kind of where that comes in. But you can see clearly the problem with this is candidates like Sanders that have a clear distinction between the corporate Democrats and the pack to some degree are at a disadvantage because the hardest attacks that they may be able to level is not necessarily leveled in the primaries. So this conceals some of the power that's associated with Sanders of the race. That said, Sanders does want to keep this substantive because he believes that he can win a policy discussion. The problem is that policy is not necessarily the thing that always determines who gets elected. Now, Joe Biden screaming that he's a progressive gives Sanders an in to kind of elucidate the interviewer about the reality of events. That's the problem with words, right? Words can be bent into saying all sorts of things. Insofar as those words line up to reality, though, is when I can give some level of evaluation. Joe Biden, in his head, I don't believe it, but may have this kind of warped sense of himself being a progressive. But talk to me about policy, Joe. Explain to me policy. Because then when you're explaining to me about policy, I can line those things up with the real world and make some determination about whether or not you're just lying. Joe Biden is lying. Joe Biden is lying. Let's let Sanders get his piece first, and then we'll talk about it after.
Pharmaceutical companies make billions in profits, and 1 out of 5 Americans cannot afford the medicine they need. Outrageous levels of compensation. You got 34 million people who have no health insurance. Many people cannot afford their deductibles and their co-payments when they go to the doctor. Fossil fuel industry makes billions of profits while they destroy the planet. Wall Street makes profits and they're charging people 17% interest rates on their credit cards. I think people see the rich getting much, much richer and the level of income and wealth inequality increasingly dangerous from a moral perspective and from an economic perspective.
I'm sure you saw Joe Biden say that he is the most progressive candidate in this race.
Well, look, Joe is a good friend of mine, and I'm not here to attack Joe. Joe voted for the war in Iraq. I led the effort against it. Joe voted for NAFTA and permanent normal trade relations, trade agreements with China. I led the effort against that. Joe voted for the deregulation of Wall Street. I voted against that. I think if you look at Joe's record and you look at my record, I don't think there's much question about who's more progressive.
I often wonder when they say stuff like this, they know that it's nonsense. The reporter who asked that question knew that the question was nonsense, meaning Joe Biden saying it was utter and complete nonsense. How do you take him seriously when he says stuff like that, like so over the top? That's as bad as Donald Trump saying that he had the largest crowds at his inauguration. Bernie Sanders went through a few of the items. Let's go through a few more. Medicare for all. Joe Biden says he doesn't have time to talk about Medicare for all, man. I don't have time to lay out my health care, man. I want to talk about values. Let's get into some values talking. The reason that Joe Biden and Booty wants to talk about values as opposed to talking about policy is because their policies are somewhat lacking. Joe Biden wants to get in office on his name, and talking about policies creates somewhat of a problem for him to do that, especially in a primary that has gotten decidedly to the left. Let's do the progressive benchmark. Medicare for all. Nope. He don't have time to lay out his health care plan. I don't have time for this man. He goes so far as to say, the approach, one in which the former vice president has focused on values needed in the American president instead of specifics and policy. I wonder why. Is it because the policy is lacking? Student debt. Joe Biden, so he doesn't have empathy for the students today. That is an amazing prospect considering that the leftist position is to get rid of student debt. Even Elizabeth Warren is on board for that. North Korea, listen to this.
And I am on record of this as 4 years ago. I agree with the Israeli position on this. If we have evidence that they are building a missile defense, a missile system, an offensive system with a nuclear capacity, and they will not negotiate with us, I would support a unilateral strike to take them out.
That's him talking about a unilateral strike. That's amazing. This is supposedly on North Korea, but he's talking about Donald Trump supposedly got a warning from Israel that Iran was about to launch an attack on interests of the United States, on the United States. Can you really trust Israel with this information? My point is this. Just because one of your allies gives you a heads up that X is about to take place doesn't in fact mean X is about to take place. And there's somewhat problem that the United States is acting unilaterally, and the question has to become, why is the United States acting unilaterally if this is something that the world recognizes as a problem? Meaning, it's one thing for the United States to say X is a problem. It's another thing for it to, in fact, be a problem. Venezuela, for example. Let's keep going. This is him.
I get on with him.
Talking about how much he likes Dick Cheney.
Man. When I went to see him, I didn't talk to him before.
That's him talking about how awesome Dick Cheney is. I gotta be honest, this doesn't seem like it's going in the direction of progressivism to me. And it appears that Joe Biden saying that he's the most progressive politician, that Joe Biden was just lying through his teeth. Joe Biden was lying through his teeth.
Companies make billions in profits and what?
This is the first opportunity, at least that I've seen, where Sanders has gone far into this notion of, look, we are dramatically different. And fortunately, this lie allowed him the leeway to do so. The question becomes the debates. When these guys get on the debate stage, because the debate stage is supposedly random, it's hard to know who's going to be on stage with who. It should get interesting. I've said on this channel that I don't believe Joe Biden is the strongest competitor. That litany of items that Joe Biden is going to have to explain on the debate stage to the American public, to a primary audience that is decidedly moved further to the left, I think it's going to be a problem. Now, I think lefties, even me, have somewhat of a bias towards issues of policy. Hillary Clinton wasn't getting elected for issues of policy. In fact, she ran the race less on issues of policy and more so on how awful Donald Trump is. Races and elections can be made by more things than policy. And sometimes the left gets wrapped up in this notion of policy and loses out on this notion that sometimes people are chosen for other reasons. I honestly don't think that's going to be the case with Biden, though, even though, fair enough, that's potentially a blind spot for me. But nevertheless, Bernie Sanders creates contrasts and pushing back on the ridiculous notion that Joe Biden is supposedly most progressive. It's utterly absurd. I'm going to end this here because I didn't want this one to be long. And I have, like I said, a list of videos that I need to get done today. So if you guys enjoy the content, please consider supporting this content through PayPal or Patreon. Thanks all.